Okay, so, when we talk about Christianity today, it's easy to kind of picture it in those traditional strongholds, Europe, North America. But the reality is,
Hmm.
Christianity in the 21st century is a global phenomenon. And that's exactly what we're diving into today.
It really is. And I think for so many people, it can be kind of a surprise to see just how widespread Christianity has become.
Yeah, and so today's deep dive is focused on a really fascinating question that what is the current state of the gospel around the world?
Right?
And to help us unpack this, we're going to be looking closely at the State of the Gospel by Jason Mandrick, who's deeply involved with Operation World, which I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with.
Yeah. And one of the things that Mandrick makes really clear right from the start is that the core message of the gospel, the good news,
Right.
it's unchanging.
Hmm.
But how the methods, the pathways, even the places where that message is being lived out and shared, that's constantly evolving.
Right. So to give our listeners a roadmap, where are we headed in this conversation? What are the key areas we're going to be exploring today?
Well, we're going to start by looking at the geographical spread of Christianity. I mean, it's across all 6 inhabited continents, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
We'll then compare its growth to other major religions and look at how it measures up against the overall global population growth, which is booming.
Right.
Then we'll delve into the diversity of Christian expression across different cultures, which is one of the most fascinating aspects of this whole topic.
Absolutely.
And then we'll shift gears a bit and examine this really significant transition of influence from the historically dominant Western church to the rapidly growing churches in the majority world. And finally, we'll tackle the question of who still hasn't had a genuine opportunity to hear the gospel and what that remaining task looks like.
Sounds like a packed agenda. So let's start with that geographical spread.
Okay.
You mentioned Christianity taking root across 6 continents. Can you give us a sense of just how widespread it actually is?
Yeah. So Christianity, unlike any other major world religion, really does span the globe. I mean, you think about Latin America,
Right.
a significant portion of the population there identifies as Christian, and then sub-Saharan Africa, in many nations, Christianity is now the majority faith. And then you look at Asia, beyond just the headlines about certain regions. You have countries like the Philippines with a very strong Christian heritage.
It's really interesting looking at some of the overall numbers I came across, what seems like a bit of a paradox, because while the total number of Christians worldwide is higher than ever, the percentage of the global population that's Christian hasn't really grown that much over the last century. It's sort of stayed around that 30% mark. So what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a great observation. You're right around 1900, about 33% of the world's population was Christian. And today it's roughly 32.6%. And the primary reason for that is really the incredible scale of global population growth.
Okay.
So while the number of Christians has increased dramatically, the world's population has just exploded over the last century.
Yeah.
So the growth of Christianity has more or less kept pace with this massive population increase. But when we zoom in a bit, we see that evangelical Christianity is experiencing a much more rapid growth.
That's right. And that was something that really stood out to me in the research. It's not just keeping pace, it's actually growing much faster. Can you elaborate on that a little?
Sure. Evangelicalism is actually the fastest growing religious movement globally, and its rate of growth is more than double that of Islam, which is also seeing significant growth.
Wow.
And it's about triple the rate of overall world population growth.
More than double. That's a huge difference.
Yeah, it's a pretty dramatic difference, and it really points to a dynamic shift that's happening within the religious landscape.
And you touched on this earlier, the incredible diversity of how Christian faith is expressed globally.
Yes.
And I think it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking of church and worship in a very specific, culturally familiar way.
It's very easy to do that. And when you start to look at Christianity across different cultures, the variations are just fascinating. I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
In some African churches, worship might be this vibrant, hours-long celebration with call and response singing and expressive dance.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have a more reserved liturgical service in a European cathedral.
Yeah, totally different.
And even things like communion or the kind of stories that are emphasized in sermons can vary dramatically, reflecting local cultures and values.
It's really interesting how even the portrayal of Jesus in art, the styles of church buildings, they all take on this local flavor.
Absolutely. I think it really speaks to the adaptability of the faith and the way that this universal message is finding resonance in these very diverse human experiences.
So let's talk about this shift in the centers of Christianity. I mean, for centuries, the Western Church, Europe and North America, has really been the dominant force.
Right.
But is that changing?
It has changed dramatically, and it's continuing to change. If you think back to the early church, the great theologians, the missionary movements, over the past few centuries, those were largely rooted in the West. But in the last 100 years, we've seen this monumental shift. And now Western Christians make up a minority of the global church.
And you mentioned Europe specifically. The statistics there paint a pretty stark picture.
They do. In 1900, about 70% of the world's Christians lived in Europe.
Wow.
Today, that number is closer to 20%. And in fact, Europe is the only continent where the overall number of Christians is actually declining.
Really?
Yeah, in many European nations, evangelical faith is held by a tiny percentage of the population. In some cases, less than 1 in 1,000.
Less than 1 in 1,000. That's incredible.
And it's often described now as largely a post-Christian continent.
So is that the whole story in Europe, or is there more to it?
Well, there is more to it, because while we see this decline in traditional church attendance, there's also this resurgence that's taking place, kind of like a reformation. We're seeing the growth of house church movements, the rise of megachurches, and the impact of charismatic renewal movements.
Interesting.
And also you have this huge influx of immigrants into Europe from other parts of the world, many of whom are Christians, and they're bringing this vibrant faith with them, injecting new energy and diversity into the European church.
And what about North America? Because it feels different from Europe. Are we seeing similar trends here?
North America is a bit more nuanced. The percentage of the global Christian population living in North America has stayed relatively stable since 1900, and a good chunk of the population still identifies as Christian.
Right.
And evangelical Christians continue to have a notable influence in society.
But there are challenges, too.
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that Mandrick points to is this kind of uncomfortable reality that this region with a strong Christian presence is also a major exporter of things like pornography, violent entertainment, a culture of materialism, and the church in North America is grappling with these same forces, which can hinder its effectiveness. But then you have a similar phenomenon to what's happening in Europe. Immigrant communities playing a big role in revitalizing churches, and the growth of multi-ethnic megachurches is a really significant development.
So challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so let's talk about the majority world, primarily Africa and Asia.
Right.
The growth of Christianity there sounds explosive.
It is a truly dramatic story. By the end of the 20th century, Christianity had become the majority religion in sub-Saharan Africa.
Wow.
In 1900, there were roughly 8 million Christians in Africa. By the year 2000, that number had skyrocketed to 351 million.
That's amazing.
And despite a lot of economic hardship and political instability, African evangelical Christians are now sending out tens of thousands of cross-cultural missionaries.
Wow.
The scale of growth is astounding. And in Asia, too.
Yeah.
The church has grown from about 22 million in 1900 to around 370 million by 2005.
Yeah.
In fact, Christianity is the fastest growing religion in Asia.
Faster than anywhere else.
Yeah, and altogether, Christians in the majority world now make up over 60% of the entire global Christian population. It's a fundamental reshaping of the Christian landscape.
Talk about a reversal from a century ago.
It really is.
But with such rapid growth, are there unique challenges that these burgeoning Christian communities are facing?
Yeah, definitely. So in Africa, for example, while millions have embraced the gospel, there's still a need to address some of the traditional customs and worldviews that don't necessarily align with Christian teachings.
Okay.
There's a real need for more theological institutions and curriculum that's relevant to the African context, and also the development of more African theologians.
Right.
And then in Asia, despite the incredible growth, Christians face significant persecution in many countries, harassment, discrimination, arrest, and even violence.
That's heartbreaking to hear. Are there similar trends in other parts of the majority world, like Latin America or the Pacific Islands?
Well, Latin America saw amazing evangelical growth in the 20th century, growing from under 1 million to over 55 million adherents. But there are still less reached areas, particularly among indigenous populations, and things like church splits and challenges with discipleship can sometimes hinder further progress. And in the Pacific, the overall trend has actually been a decrease in the Christian population.
Really?
Due to things like emigration, societal decline, and increasing nominalism, which is where people identify as Christian, but they don't really practice their faith.
Hmm.
But there are pockets of renewed growth and a vision for mission in places like Australia and New Zealand.
Interesting.
And then the Middle East has seen a significant decline in its Christian population
Yeah.
due to ongoing discrimination, persecution, and emigration, even with increased prayer and efforts in gospel communication.
Okay, so that brings us to global mission. I
Right.
mean, with this dramatic shift in where Christians are concentrated, how has the landscape of missions changed?
Well, the growth of the majority world church has fueled an incredible rise in majority world mission movements. Churches in places like Africa, Asia, and Latin America are now sending out as many cross-cultural missionaries as historically Western churches.
Wow.
So mission is no longer just a one-way flow from the West to the rest. It's become an everywhere-to-everywhere movement.
That's a great way to put it, everywhere to everywhere. And, one statistic that really surprised me was about Mongolia being the most efficient missionary sending country. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it really does challenge our assumptions about missions, because when you compare the number of believers in Mongolia to the number of missionaries they send out,
Yeah.
they have a remarkably high ratio for every 222 believers. One is serving with a mission organization.
That's incredible.
It's not about having centuries of Christian history or tons of money. It often comes down to zeal and a desire to share what they've experienced.
That's so inspiring. And what are some other examples of these majority world mission efforts in action?
Well, we're seeing Latin Americans using their cultural skills, things like sports or music ministries, to connect with people
Okay.
who might be resistant to more traditional Western approaches. And then you have Filipinos and Indonesians who've moved to wealthier nations for work, and they're sharing their faith in their workplaces and communities.
Hmm.
And then there's the Back to Jerusalem movement from China, which has this vision of sending missionaries westward along the ancient Silk Roads.
Right.
And we're also seeing African-led church planting in Europe and missions to North Africa. So it's a really diverse and dynamic picture.
So we've talked about this global reach of Christianity, the rise of these new mission forces, but there's still a huge task remaining reaching those who haven't yet heard the gospel.
Absolutely. And just because Christians live in pretty much every country now, that doesn't mean everyone has heard the message.
Right.
There are still massive concentrations of people who haven't had a chance to understand and respond to the good news.
And the numbers in some of these regions are just mind-boggling.
They are. If you look at the countries with the largest populations where the gospel has had the least impact, 5 stand out: India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal.
Wow.
Just those 5 countries alone. Hundreds of millions of people who are considered unevangelized.
And it's more complex than just reaching countries, right? Because Jesus's command to reach the nations had a more nuanced meaning.
When Jesus talked about nations, he wasn't just talking about political boundaries on a map. He was talking about ethnic groups, people who share a language, culture, and often history.
Right.
This really expands the scope of the task because within one country, you can have hundreds of distinct people groups, each needing a unique approach.
And that's where this idea of unreached people groups comes in.
Right. An unreached people group is a group where there's no indigenous community of Christians who can effectively evangelize their own people. And these groups exist across many different religions. And the 5 Asian countries we mentioned before, they're also home to the largest numbers of unreached people groups.
Like who specifically?
Well, you have the Muslim Houthi people in China, the Fulani, a nomadic group spread across Africa, and the Marsh Arabs in Iraq, each group needing a very specific approach.
So it sounds like there's this imbalance in where mission efforts are focused.
Sadly, there is. Even though about 27% of the world's population is considered unevangelized, only a tiny fraction of missionaries are actually working among these groups.
Really?
Yeah, it's estimated to be about 1 out of every 40, and this results in incredibly low missionary-to-population ratios.
So as we look ahead, what are some of the global needs that go beyond just that initial act of evangelism?
It's really about holistic transformation, addressing all sorts of human needs.
Right.
This includes the well-being of women and children, poverty, refugees, AIDS, the environment, urbanization, resource shortages. The global church needs to be engaged on all these fronts.
So what are the priorities for the church moving forward to effectively address this task?
Manuch outlines several. One is a much greater involvement from all believers in the Great Commission. Even if just a couple more people out of every 100 were actively engaged, it would make a huge difference.
That makes sense.
The second thing is a spirit of sacrifice. a willingness to give of our careers, our finances, our time.
Right.
And the third is partnership between those who pray, those who give, those who train, and those who go, as well as collaboration between Western and majority world churches.
Okay.
And then unity within the global church expressed through multicultural mission teams.
I like that.
And finally, the absolute necessity of prayer, as Operation World puts it. When man works, but when man prays, God works.
So it's clear that the story of the gospel spread is dynamic and always evolving, with some really big challenges still ahead of us.
Definitely, we've seen this amazing globalization of Christianity, the emergence of the majority world church, and the reality of the billions who still haven't heard the gospel.
So as you've been listening today, what part of this global state of the gospel resonates most with you? And maybe what's one small step you could take to engage with this global reality, whether it's learning more, praying intentionally, or supporting those on the front lines?
Yeah, there's so much we can do.
It's a vast landscape, but even the smallest steps can make a difference.